I have found a friend in Jesus, he's everything to me. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. The lily of the valley, in him alone I see. All I need to cleanse and make me fully whole. In sorrow he's my comfort, in trouble he's my stay. He tells me every care on him to roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul. He will never, never leave me, nor yet forsake me here, while I'll live by faith and do his blessed will. Oh, wall of fire about me, I've nothing now to fear. When his manna he my hungry soul shall fill. Then sweeping up to glory, to see his blessed face, where rivers of Elijah ever roll. He's the lily of the valley, the bright and morning star. He's the fairest of 10,000 to my soul.
Our speaker this hour is Brother Todd Houston. Todd is the preacher for the Elizabethan Church of Christ here in Elizabethan, Tennessee. Also, last I heard, Todd's going to be our Greek teacher. Is that correct? You know, students, good luck with that one. From what I've got to know Todd a little bit, and we've been to C Street several times. I still call it C Street. It's Elizabethan. Fantastic speaker. Fantastic. His topic this hour is in James, he is the Lord of hosts. Todd can speak to it.
Well, good morning, brother. It is so good to be with you again. Owe an apology to my fellow speakers. I purposefully ducked out on your lectures so far this week. It didn't sound like much of an apology, did it? But I'll explain. I am not capable of being around my brethren without talking an awful lot, and if you are listening, you might notice I sound a little different than I usually do. Battling a little bit of laryngitis, which is why I have all this hardware up here with me. And so I knew if I were here a lot, I would be talking a lot, and I might not be able to talk during this time here. But I believe that I have reserved just enough that we can talk about Jesus as the Lord of hosts in James. And so I appreciate your forbearance with me on that, and I look forward to seeing you while we are here. So James chapter 5 is the place where we see this phrase, the Lord of hosts, or the Lord of Sabaoth, as you may see in your translation, particularly in verse 4. And we're going to get back around to the context of this to discuss the significance of Jesus being the Lord of hosts in a moment. But that is where we will pick up when we get to the context of James. But before we get there, I want to just point something out here pertaining to the theme of this lectureship. I love this theme, Jesus as the center of the Bible, because truly that's everything is building to him and what he did. And so that brings up another significant point that we need to consider, and I'm thankful for Daniel bringing this out just a few moments ago, the relationship of the Old and the New Covenants, and how the New Covenant grew out of the Old Covenant. It was the fulfillment, as a matter of fact, of the Old Covenant, and I appreciate the fact that he pointed out that our understanding of each of those covenants is interdependent, right? I need to know the Old Covenant in order to understand the New. Now, it's true we have to make a distinction, and there are those who have not made that distinction and often seek authority for various religious practices in the Old Covenant. We don't do that. We don't have the authority to do that. Our charter, or our constitution, if you want to call it that, is the New Covenant, no doubt. But the ways in which we understand that best are by understanding the relationship that it has to the Old Testament. And so for this lesson that we're looking at, this is going to be especially crucial, and I'll explain. But before we get to that, I just want to bring up a story about this, something that the pendulum swinging the other way as it pertains to the Old Testament. There was a couple when we moved to Rockwood, came to visit just a few months after we had gotten there, and she actually grew up in the congregation, and she had left the church and just kind of went from here, there, and yonder, whatever church that she could find. She and her husband, they visited all over the place. They weren't attached to any specific religious body. They believed in God, believed in Jesus, all those things. Well, they came to visit, and so we invited them out to eat with us after worship that Sunday evening. And while we were there, she laughed, and she told me how she had told her husband, who was completely unfamiliar with the church. She said, "Now, when we get in here, you're not going to hear anything from the Old Testament, and you're not going to hear anything from Revelation." Because the assumption was that we weren't going to talk about those things. We weren't going to deal with Revelation because it's often difficult or whatever, and we weren't going to get into the Old Testament because, in her view, we had just left that behind. Now, it's probably an exaggeration of the case, but is it possible that we, in our understanding that we live under the new, can completely abandon the old? I've actually seen some of that along the way. But that's not the picture that we see in the Scriptures. It's not what we see in the New Testament for sure. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 and 18, Jesus had this to say. He said, "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law, till all is fulfilled." Okay, so Jesus was emphatic that he came not to destroy, but to fulfill. Now, after his crucifixion, his burial, and his resurrection, if we turn to Luke chapter 24, we see him utilize the full scope of what we now call the Old Testament in order to demonstrate that he was, in fact, the Christ. He's talking to, initially here, we pick up in verse 19, and we can look and see him talking to these two disciples who are walking on the road to Emmaus, right? And they're confounded with the report that they've heard that the Savior's not in the tomb. Where did he go? What happened here? And so he asked them about these things, and he said to them, "What things?" The things they're discussing. So they said to him, "The things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel." You see that everything that their hopes were hanging on, they thought Jesus was it. And in this moment, having witnessed him ultimately meet his earthly demise and not being sure of all the things that were being reported, I said, well, we thought it was him, but apparently it wasn't. Now, how is he going to flesh out their understanding? Well, you drop down to verse 25, and after they've told him about the report from the women and all of these things and how they went and checked and they didn't see him, he says, "O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the Scriptures the things concerning himself." And so Jesus, the center of the Bible, I think he's confirming the theme of this lectureship here. You drop on down a little further in Luke chapter 24, and we pick up particularly there in verse 36, and he is now speaking to them, and Jesus stood in the midst of them and said, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they had seen a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see that I have." And so they go on, they give him some food to eat. And verse 44, he says this, "These are the words which I spoke to you while I was still with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms concerning me." And he opened their understanding that they might comprehend the Scriptures. So Jesus said in Matthew 5:17 and 18 that he came not to destroy the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them, to bring them to their designed end, to bring them to their purpose, which was to usher in the Christ, right? And then in Luke chapter 24, he says, this is what was written of me. These are the things that had to happen in order for God to do what he said he was going to do. As we continue this case, later in Acts chapter 3, verses 11 through 26, you see Peter, after having healed this lame man, and they're trying to figure out what's going on with that, and he points them back to state that it was these things that were spoken by the prophets, okay? Verse 18 specifically, but those things which God foretold by the mouth of all his prophets that the Christ would suffer, he has thus fulfilled. Paul later in Acts 13 says the same thing, okay? And so every bit of this is bringing us to Paul's conclusion that we read in Romans chapter 10, verse 4, which is where I want us to take what we're looking at this morning and consider. Romans chapter 10, verse 4, Paul says, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. When you hear the word end, what do we typically think about? End of the road, right? Terminal point, which is true about Jesus as well. But that's not the thrust of what Paul is saying here. The word that he uses is a Greek word, telos. Okay, you might be familiar with the teleological argument for the existence of God. Anybody heard of that? I'm sure you have. Many in this room are very familiar with it. It is an argument from design, from the word telos. That is the root of that idea of design. And so let's read it like this. Christ is the design, the goal, the intended purpose of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. So when we stack all of that together, we find that it all was building to Jesus, the Christ. And so, yes, he is the center of the Bible. Now, let's take this to James chapter 5. The reason I went through that with you is because this phrase that we're looking at, the Lord of hosts, if you were to do a search on this particular phrase, you would find that, at least according to eSword, when I entered this data in there, it's got a really handy search function. I don't know if you ever use that. But you can go in and search for an exact phrase. And it showed up that there were 247 occurrences of the phrase Lord of hosts or Lord of Sabaoth, as it is found in the King James Version of the Bible. 245 of those are in the Old Covenant. Okay? One of the two that's in the New Covenant is a direct quotation of Isaiah. And that's found in Romans chapter 9, verse 29. And so we have one independent expression of the phrase Lord of Sabaoth or Lord of hosts in the New Testament. And that is found here in James chapter 5, verse 4. So let's read this for just a moment, and then we're going to see why we need to go back to the Old Covenant in order to understand what James is trying to convey when he describes the Lord as the Lord of hosts and uses this image. So we're going to pick up in verse 1. We're just going to go ahead and read down through verse 11 because this will give us a little bit broader context of what James is dealing with. He says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And here it is. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth, or the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in a day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist you. Now he turns to the other side of this, to those who are dealing with such oppression, and calls them to patience. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. You also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. So we're going to see, as we look at this a little more closely, in order to understand the use that James has here, we need to go back and see how this was used in the Old Covenant. And so I turn your attention first to 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now, a little earlier in 1 Samuel chapter 1 is where we first encounter the phrase, the Lord of hosts, in the Bible. And so along the way, though, we're going to see there are different uses of this. The word host just means a gathered mass in its most basic sense. It has to do with service. But more often than not, you're going to find, if you trace that through the Old Covenant, that it has military connotations. Okay? The Lord, that is Yahweh, in these particular phrases, Yahweh of hosts, the Lord of the armies. And you're going to see that that can be at times talking about the armies of Israel. It also, though, largely has to do with the armies of the heavenly host, armies of angels. You look in various contexts, and we're going to do that right now. But in 1 Samuel 17, verses 45 through 47, here we have this young man, David, who is standing ready to fight this Philistine champion, okay? Who, depending on how we reckon the cubit at the time, was what, he was north of 9 feet tall. How many going to throw your hand up to go fight this cat? I'm going to tell you, I wouldn't be the first in line to do that, right? I'd probably be just like those other cowering Israelites that I like to mock and laugh at as I read that text in 1 Samuel 17. But here comes David, and David's wired up differently. And you know why David's wired up differently? Because he is trusting not in his own might, he is trusting in one that is described here as the Lord of hosts. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, this is when he's already interacting now with Goliath. He says, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. And mind you, if we go back and look, he's quite proficient with those implements of war, isn't he? Goliath is described as a champion. He's one who's seasoned in battle. David's not. David has been out tending the sheep. Now, he has some experience in danger and in fighting enemies that are stronger than he, bears and lions and such. And so he has that, but he's never been in battle. So he says, you come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts. Okay? The God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Okay? Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. If Israel had only had this mindset all the way through, we wouldn't even have a book of Judges. We wouldn't have all that insanity that's going on over there. If you ever want to just get your stomach churning up over some really despicable things, just go hover around in the book of Judges for a while, especially those latter chapters, the things that the people of God had stooped to. And there's a warning in that for us, isn't there? We take our eyes off of the Lord of hosts, and we can find ourselves in similar trouble to them. So God's might and his authority are at the center of this phrase, the Lord of hosts, that we are looking at this morning. And so let's continue on. Psalm 89, picking up in verse 5 there. And again, we see the Lord of hosts coming out in this, but we see something of who these hosts can be. It says, the heavens will praise your wonders, O Lord, your faithfulness also in the assembly of the saints. For who in the heavens can be compared to the Lord? Who among the sons of the mighty can be likened to the Lord? God is greatly to be feared in the assembly of the saints, and to be held in reverence by all those around him. O Lord God of hosts, who is mighty like you, O Lord? Your faithfulness also surrounds you. You rule the raging of the sea. When its waves rise, you still them. You have broken Rahab in pieces as one who is slain. You have scattered your enemies with your mighty arm. The heavens are yours, the earth also is yours. The world and all its fullness, you have founded them. The north and the south, you have created them. Tabor and Hermon rejoice in your name. You have a mighty arm, strong is your hand and high is your right hand. Look at that. Do you hear the description here? Do you see the language of the Lord God of hosts? It's little wonder then you get into Psalm 148 and we see the heavens praising him. We see everything. Let them praises give Jehovah, right? For his name alone is high. This is the imagery that is in back of the Lord of hosts that James is picking up in this context. I want to give you one more here to consider in Jeremiah chapter 20. At a time that Jeremiah was about to quit, he had decided, you got me into this, Lord, and everything's falling apart. They hate my guts. They want to kill me. It's just not worth it anymore. You ever been nigh on to quitting? We might not be quick to raise our hands and confess to that. But since I'm up here, I'll just go ahead and say that there have been times where I've just about given up. There was a time in my younger years where I gave up altogether. But I'm talking about even in my later years where I know the Lord of hosts, right? And I know what he's capable of. And this is when I need a reminder of who it is I serve. And I need to remember the likes of Elijah. I don't know that I'll ever scale the heights that Elijah did as a servant of God. I don't know that I'll ever be anything near what Jeremiah was. But look at where Jeremiah is here in chapter 20. Verse 7, he says, O Lord, you induced me, and I was persuaded. You are stronger than I and have prevailed. I am in derision daily. Everyone mocks me. For when I spoke, I cried out. I shouted violence and plunder because the word of the Lord was made to me a reproach and a derision daily. Then I said, I will not make mention of him, nor speak any more in his name. Jeremiah's just about had it. I just can't do it anymore. But his word was in my heart like a burning fire, shut up in my bones. I was weary of holding it back, and I could not. For I heard many mocking, fear on every side. Report, they say, and we will report it. All my acquaintances watch for my stumbling, saying, perhaps he can be induced. Then we will prevail against him, and we will take our revenge on him. But look at this. But the Lord is with me as a mighty, awesome one. You may have a dread warrior in your translation. Therefore my persecutors will stumble and will not prevail. They will be greatly ashamed, for they will not prosper. Their everlasting confusion will never be forgotten. But, O Lord of hosts, there it is. You who test the righteous and see the mind and heart, let me see your vengeance on them, for I have pleaded my cause before you. Sing to the Lord, praise the Lord, for he has delivered the life of the poor from the hand of evildoers. Man, what a theme, right? Here's a man of God, a servant of the Lord of hosts, ready to quit. He's been mocked. He's been mistreated in every way you can imagine. And things only get worse for him after a little while, don't they? But then he sees things as they really are. He sees who is in back of him here, who it is that stands and will carry him through it. Jeremiah realizes it's not on him, it is not in him to win the battles that he must fight. He has to lean on the Lord of hosts. Now let's bring that to today here for a moment. We'll come back to this when we get to the application of James particularly. You ever feel like the forces amassing against us, they're just getting stronger and stronger? I love these United States, don't you? I'm thankful to have grown up here and nowhere else on this earth. I've never been to all those other places, so maybe I'm just speaking in my ignorance. But I have enjoyed my life here on this earth in this country. But in the short period of time that I've been on this earth and been aware of what's going on around me, I've seen drastic changes. Some of you that have been around here longer than me, I'd love to hear what you could tell me about life before what I see today. We are a nation undoubtedly in decline, especially morally, religiously. We are a post-Christian nation as far as that description is used. It's applicable. It's true. And so we're going to have to face the reality that we may come upon pressures like we've never seen before as servants of God in this particular country. So it's times like this when we really need to know the Lord of hosts, to know who he is, what he's about, and what he can and will do for us. Because if the forces that were amassed against Jeremiah can bring him to the brink of failure where he was, but then he remembers the Lord of hosts and he recognizes that he has a dread warrior with him, can we not do the same? Isn't that what we have to do? To march on in the Lord's army, doing the Lord's bidding. And so, let's look at this. The Lord of hosts, everything that we've seen, it highlights God's might, his authority, and he's fighting for the cause of justice, for uprightness. That's what the Bible is all about, isn't it? I'm a servant of God. You're servants of God. We have religious obligations. We have moral obligations. Have you ever thought about the reality that I can't do anything and you can't do anything directly to God, whether for or against? I can't add to him directly, can I? Nor can I take from him. How is it that my service to God is lived out? It's in my day-to-day life with all of you. Look at Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46 there, that judgment scene that we have. What was it that he talks about there? He said, you saw me naked and clothed me. You saw me hungry and you fed me. You saw me sick and you visited me, and imprisoned and you came to me, all those things. And they said, when did we do that? And on the flip side, he said to others, they didn't. They said, when did we see you in this state and didn't minister to you? And he said, inasmuch as you did or didn't do it to one of these, the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. And so the way that we treat one another in this world, the way that we carry on with our fellow mankind, that is directly how we treat the Lord. What I do with you is what I do to him. And so he has a deep interest in interhuman affairs, right? You go back and look at the law of Moses. There are commandments in there. Who are some of the ones that are especially prominent in the law of Moses, in Leviticus, later in the prophets? It's the helpless, isn't it? Doesn't he always come back to those who are vulnerable, those who are weak, those who cannot defend themselves? That's who the Lord is concerned with, and that's who he wants his people especially to be concerned with. Now, in the spiritual realm, that's everybody, because we're all helpless, we're all vulnerable, and we're all hopeless without Jesus the Christ. But in this life, he gives us so much, and that's the context of James chapter 5, we're going to see in just a moment. But the Lord of hosts, as described above, he is one who is going to mete out justice. It may look like the forces of evil are winning, but they are not. They cannot defeat us unless we just yield to them. We cannot be overpowered by those enemies, even death. That's the point. In what Jesus did, when he rose from the grave, he defeated the greatest enemy of all. Death can't even hold us. And so what have we to fear other than turning away from the Lord of hosts? So here's what I want us to think about. This is a double-edged sword, the Lord of hosts. If we stand with him, we have great assurance, do we not? 2 Kings chapter 6, here in verse 13. And in this context here, we see these Syrians come and they're going to attack, and Elisha is the focal point here. And so in verse 13, he said, "Go and see where he is, that I may send and get him." And it was told him, saying, "Surely he is in Dothan." Okay? This speaking of Elisha. It says, "Therefore he sent horses and chariots and a great army there, and they came by night and surrounded the city. And when the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? You're surrounded by an army, taken by surprise. What are we going to do? So he answered, Do not fear, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them. Now he goes on, and Elisha prays, and the Lord opens the man's eyes. The young man is able to look around and see that the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. And so the Syrians are defeated. Can you think of another instance, perhaps a little bit later on in 2 Kings, when ultimately God is going to deliver the people of Judah from the Assyrian army? And they don't even have to fire an arrow. 185,000, I believe it is, died that day, right? And the people of Judah were napping through the whole thing. Surrounded, helpless, hopeless, except for this. The Lord of hosts was there. He was the one who delivered them from this peril. And so look at Psalm 46, verses 7 through 11 here. And this is the side of the equation for those who are his, those who are with him. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes war cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot in the fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. What do we have to fear? What can this administration or the next one do to God's people ultimately? Sure, they can make it hard on us here in this life, but we can soldier on. When we get to prison, if that happens, we can sing songs to God, just like Paul and Silas, can't we? We can write letters to our loved ones on the outside, encouraging them like Paul did young Timothy while he sat in prison awaiting his demise. So the double-edged sword, on the one hand, it cuts in favor of those who stand with him. But what about those who stand in opposition to him? Well, we know the end of those things. Look at Isaiah chapter 2, verse 12. And I'm just going to hit some highlights here and then get back to the context of James. It says, For the day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low. People may stand and shake their fist at God, and they may think that they're going to defeat his purposes, and they're going to defeat his people, and that they're going to get by with oppressing those who cannot defend themselves. But the cries, remember James chapter 5, verse 4, the cries of the reapers have come to the ears of the Lord of hosts. He is aware, he does care, and he will deliver. That's the message throughout this entire concept. Isaiah chapter 31, verses 1 through 9 are really important in this. They were looking for help in Egypt, okay? And, I mean, they have chariots, right? They have horsemen. They have all of the military strength that we need. And so he says, Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help and rely on horses, who trust in chariots because they are many, and in horsemen because they are very strong, but who do not look to the Holy One of Israel, nor seek the Lord. Brethren, let's never let that be the description of us. We have enemies that we must face. We have challenges we must encounter. But let's not look to human solutions to those. That doesn't mean that we don't participate in things in the here and now, okay? But we can't put our trust in that. You ever been let down by human beings that you thought would never let you down? It's happened, hasn't it? We've had family members that have let us down, haven't we? We've had friends that have let us down, haven't we? We've had our favorite preachers in the world that have let us down, or elders in the Lord's church who have let us down. You know why? Because they're flesh and blood just like you and me. They're weak, sometimes ignorant, sometimes rebellious. Sometimes we just turn from him instead of turning to him. So we seek our refuge in him. Yet he also is wise and will bring disaster and will not call back his words, but will arise against the house of evildoers and against the help of those who work iniquity. Now the Egyptians are men and not God, and their horses are flesh and not spirit. When the Lord stretches out his hand, both he who helps will fall, and he who is helped will fall down. they will all perish together. For thus the Lord has spoken to me, as a lion roars and a young lion over his prey, when a multitude of shepherds is summoned against him, he will not be afraid of their voice, nor be disturbed by their noise. So the Lord of hosts will come down to fight for Mount Zion and for its hill. Like birds flying about, so will the Lord of hosts defend Jerusalem. Defending, he will also deliver it. Passing over, he will preserve it. What's the point? He will preserve his people, and he will fulfill his promises. Return to him against whom the children of Israel have deeply revolted. For in that day every man shall throw away his idols of silver and his idols of gold, sin which your own hands have made for yourselves. Then Assyria, now this is the mighty war machine of the time. Everybody was terrified by her. Then Assyria shall fall by a sword not of man, and a sword not of mankind shall devour him, but he shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall become forced labor. He shall cross over to his stronghold for fear, and his princes shall be afraid of the banner, says the Lord, whose fire is in Zion and whose furnace is in Jerusalem. What's the point? The Lord of hosts is with his people, and no matter what enemy those people face, the Lord of hosts will deliver them. Now let's get back to James, and let's look particularly at the context, the overarching context of James. From start to finish, James is, you ever heard it called the Proverbs of the New Testament? I think that's a pretty apt description of the book of James. You know, you have to really snooze your way through the book not to understand exactly what James wants you to do, right? There are some books where I can work as hard as I want, and I'm still kind of at the end like, oh boy, I'm going to have to spend a little time stewing on this. James doesn't give us a whole lot of that, does he? It's just, here it is, this is what it is. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into various trials, because it's going to make you better. It's going to produce patience and endurance, and those things are necessary. Don't blame God when you're tempted, because it comes from your own fleshly lusts. That's why you're having a hard time with sin. You know, James is just very matter of fact like that. But one of the things that is a chief concern in the book of James is, again, what we've talked about already, his care and his concern for the vulnerable. James chapter 1, verse 27. What is pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father? Well, to visit or to care for the orphans and widows in their trouble. We're talking about those who are in a state of helplessness here. And to keep oneself unspotted from the world. Next, in James chapter 2, you pick up in verse 1. And what does he say? Verse 1, my brethren, do not hold the faith of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with partiality. For if there should come into your assembly a man with gold rings and fine apparel, and there should also come in a poor man in filthy clothes, and you pay attention to the one wearing the fine clothes, and say to him, you sit here in a good place, and say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit here at my footstool, have you not shown partiality among yourselves, and become judges with evil thoughts? Drop down a little further, verse 14, and what's the description that he uses to talk about dead faith? He says, you see a brother or sister naked and destitute of daily food, verse 15. One of you says to them, depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body. What does it profit? He wants us to take action, right? To care for those who cannot, and I stress the word cannot, take care of themselves. I'm not talking about those like myself who are fully capable of going out and working and tending to their needs and have the opportunity to do so. I'm talking about those who are vulnerable. Now let's bring it back to chapter 5, to our primary context. And what he's dealing with in James chapter 5, where this idea of the Lord of hosts comes into play, is rich oppressors. Okay, now I want to make this statement. A lot of people have gone too far with it, and they want to eat the rich, right? You know some wealthy folks that are godly folks? I know a bunch of them. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy, okay? What is wrong is getting that way by stepping on the backs of those who can't help themselves, okay? And God absolutely will not put up with it. Nor will he put up with any other kind of oppression of those who are vulnerable. We all have strengths, right? We may have greater strength than our neighbors. I'm to use that strength to pick them up, not to press them down. And God takes this very seriously, and so must his people. So the specific context here in James, where the Lord of hosts comes out, is dealing with the oppression of the vulnerable and the fact that he is still the champion of those who are vulnerable. Right? And so let's take a look here. The fortunes of the oppressors are going to come to ruin in verses 1 through 3. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days. And so the things that they were doing, they were living immoral lives. They were doing things that God would never have anyone to do in order to soften life on this earth. There's a pretty powerful motivator in that, isn't there? You ever known anybody who had lived a morally upright life until an opportunity to make it easier came along, sold out to a life of ease? I've known people that have done that. I've known brethren who have done that, who have gone and taken work that they knew was going to keep them away from the service of the Lord because they could up their bottom line. They could increase their checking accounts or have engaged in unsavory business dealings because they could make more money more quickly and more easily. Have mistreated people along the way. So there is a danger in this, and this is what the people that the Lord is speaking to here were doing. They were oppressing those who couldn't help themselves, and so they defrauded these poor laborers. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud. I know a man who started a business one time, and he paid people cash. Now, they need to be paying their taxes anyway. But he did that so that when it came time for payday, he'd fire them the day before they were supposed to get paid, and then there was no record they'd ever worked for him. Now, after a while, he had to move out of the state and go live somewhere else because people were going to kill him. But for a while there, he had people, honest, hardworking people, come and work for him. He was supposed to pay them and then give them their documentation. But he fleeced them and stole their money. This is the kind of stuff that we're dealing with. They defrauded these poor laborers, but the cries of those laborers had come to the ears of the Lord of hosts. And so look what happens. Verse 7 and 8. Therefore what? Therefore, because the Lord of hosts still hears, and the cries of those who have been mistreated come to his ears, and he will come to their defense in the final equation. It may not be here today and in the here and now. And that's sad, isn't it? You ever get frustrated with that? Don't ask me why God decides to do it that way. That's over my pay grade. But I trust that when all is said and done, he's going to make every wrong right. He's going to put everything right as it ought to be. And so therefore, he says this, be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. I don't know when that's going to happen, when he's going to ultimately put things right, but I know that he's going to put things right. And because of that, I can look at the suffering around me. I can do what I can to alleviate it, to try and encourage the kind of living that will alleviate that. But I can wait for the precious fruit of the earth. I can wait for the one who will ultimately deliver. And in this way, my heart can be established. That's what the idea of Jesus as the Lord of hosts in the book of James is all about. That whole imagery that James is picking up from the Old Covenant, there was assurance in back of all of it. And as I said, it's a double-edged sword. So we use this as a comfort, knowing that he is going to put it right, and we are going, if we hold the line, if we remain faithful to him, no matter what it looks like today, it's all going to turn out to our good. Romans chapter 8, verse 28 says something to that effect, doesn't it? He's going to work it all out to our good. I don't know how exactly, but I know how this thing ends if I live it faithfully. And then on the other edge of that sword is a warning to any who may be tempted to give in to such things and to live on the other side of this. Know that there's no escaping. And he sees everything, and he hears the cries of those who cry out to him for help. And so many other biblical images are just like this, applicable to different places and different times. James was dealing with a very specific situation, but we can take away from this knowing that whatever ills we face, the Lord of hosts still hears us, and he will still deliver his people. Thank you kindly.
Thank you, Todd. At the 11 o'clock hour, one of our students, Jacob Martin, will be speaking. Also, at 12 o'clock, the Cherokee Church of Christ will be providing lunch for us. It will be in the fellowship hall in the school building. At 1 o'clock, John Kissamoy, is that right? Did I say that right, Mike? Okay. He's a missionary over in Kenya, and that the church here supports. He will be speaking. Well, I guess you could say from Kenya. All right? He has actually taped his lesson. We're going to show that, but after that's over, we're going to try to live stream John, and we'll be able to ask questions. He'll be able to talk to us about the work they're doing over there and so forth. And then at 2 o'clock, Chris Caseboat will be speaking to us. And also tonight at 7, Keith Ritchie will wrap it up with, in the book of Revelation, he is the victorious Lamb. So at this time, you're dismissed to the